what we're doing using the language model for learning. So how many folks here would like an A for the course? No kidding. Everybody. Wow. That's interesting. And you can. You know, years ago, it used to be really a requirement, and in fact, at some place like Princeton, it still is, that you have a magic marker that doesn't work. Which means we got to get rid of it, otherwise we'll keep doing that. Right? You see that? It's a bell curve. So it used to be that you could expect only a few, maybe 5 out of 100 or something to get A's in the class. Maybe 10 would get B's. Most would get a C. That's what it was, the average grade, right? And then you would again have folks getting D's and F's, right? And as I said, some places like Princeton still require professors to balance their grading out like this, but we do not have that requirement. I can give everybody an A in the class. That's cool, right? I never point out that, by the way, this design subliminally looks like a breast. I won't mention that. But what we've done today is cut off half of it. Which some people explain means we've gotten rid of excellence. So it also screws up that image, right? It was supposed to be funny, by the way. I tell jokes and no one laughs. That's must mean that they weren't very good, I guess.
Or maybe that your philosophy teaching is so good and they're lost in deep thought.
Wow, thanks. What's your name? A for you. Yeah.
In that case, it's H-E-I-N-T-Z. Please make sure you spell it correctly. That's a combination. That's just like the ketchup, but with the T before this.
Heinz. Well, that's a good variety. Yeah. So this is my syllabus, by the way. If you go to my main web page, this is it. Make it bigger. That is a picture of me when my friend Rembrandt painted me. That's kind of fun. That was when I was much older than I am now, but it's actually that really is my face merged into a picture by Rembrandt. So that's kind of a student of mine did that. That's Joseph Butcher did that, and gave me the picture and allowed me to use it on my website. So that's kind of cool. However, this is Introduction to Philosophy. Now, by the way, notice from my main webpage, which is just my name, W-S-J-A-M-I-S-O-N. So it's William Stephen Jamison. That's the way UAA does your name. You know, I guess each of you have a similar email address, right? .uaa.alaska.edu is the website. You don't have the UAA dot as part of my email address. It's just WSJAMISON at alaska.edu. That's all. And by the way, you need the S, because if you skip the S, you email my son. And then he politely forwards it to me and says, "Dad, I think this was for you." You know, because that's kind of fun. Main link to the main UAA site. If you're familiar with the Middle College, I have a link there. Department of Philosophy link here if you're curious about us. All of the other faculty in the philosophy department are just absolutely brilliant and much younger and handsomer or prettier, depending on how you view them, etc. They're all brilliant. I'm the odd person out. I'm the grandfathered in old guy, if that makes sense. I started teaching here in spring of '95. So this is, I think, my 24th year. If that makes sense. However. So I have some other things here. I have, besides the links to the syllabi, the courses, I have my current schedule, so you know, if you need to see where I'm at, that's really just my courses. But you could always call me, my home phone. I do have a cell phone, but I very rarely have it on, because I only use it so that I could call other people, if that makes sense. I do have some class notes. I have a Facebook page, and you're welcome to friend me if you're interested. I find it, I'm a Facebook fan. I know a lot of people that hate it for one reason or another, but I'm amazed at how. Have you seen the movie The Circle? Anybody see the movie The Circle? No one saw the movie The Circle.
I wanted to see it, but I missed it when it was in theaters, and then it didn't come. Like, I don't know where to find it now.
Tom Hanks is in it. Emma Watson is in it. It's about really kind of Google or Facebook, something like that. And the interesting thesis in the movie is that there are cameras all over the world watching everything all the time. So everything is open, you know, and everybody's interconnected, so you could like watch whatever you want live. You know, you're completely transparent, they say. And what changes will happen to a society if that happens? You know, corruption will go away. You know, if you think of it, you know, because no one will be able to do anything without everyone knowing it, right? So all kinds of interest. But of course, on the other hand, that means that everybody knows everything you're doing. And who wants to give up that kind of, you know, no privacy? Privacy is gone, right? So good, bad, very thought-provoking. Doesn't end saying which way it will be. Obviously, it's not something that you can decide, but pretty interesting. And in a way, a lot of people are talking about the world changing in that direction because, you know, WikiLeaks and other things, you know, people, you know, have message traffic, you know, they want to keep secret, but it all comes out. So, you know, yes, Heinz.
Quick question about that. So if the basic premise is that increased surveillance would lead to less corruption, could one argue then that the premise would be false based on the idea that if there's increased surveillance, one of the stratifications of society or markers of status would be how much surveillance you are or aren't subject to, and that corruption would still be possible, and perhaps in some ways corruption might be even worse because of that greater stratification. I don't know how to explain that better.
Yeah, we would vote who we're interested in and ignore the folks that we're not, and in a sense that might increase a different kind of corruption with regard to our attention, where we look.
It's my belief that corruption is an inevitable and indispensable part of the human experience or character, and that it's a relatively fixed value that will be present regardless of systems or controls imposed upon.
Would you call it entropy?
I've heard that word, but I don't understand what that word means, so I wouldn't use a word I don't know.
Yeah, you might really find that kind of interesting. One of the grading requirements for the class is a term paper, and you might find focusing on someone who's interested in entropy to be an interesting part of that. I would recommend, if you're interested in that, a book called Into the Cool. So this is, if you're familiar with Carl Sagan, or Sagan, however, I've heard it's a weird pronunciation. Sagan, yeah. His son, Dorian, is the co-author of this book, Into the Cool, which talks about entropy, and it's basically the first law of thermodynamics, and that is that all systems lose energy, and in doing that they corrupt, they fall apart. The odd thing, and he points this out, the book is mostly about this, is that life fights entropy. So theoretically, life forms should not persist, but life has a way of using energy in order to build order instead of fall apart. So it's pretty interesting to think of it that way. So there's a possibility. You could definitely think of this book as the primary, if you're interested in it for your term paper. So that's just fun. I forget where I was going with that, but that's a good question. But Facebook, I'm a member of Facebook, so I like Facebook, and I think it's pretty interesting what it's doing to our society. There's certainly going to be bad things too, all kinds of interesting stuff. I also have a blog, and what I try to do is post a comment after each class on what we discuss, basically. I'll link the video that I made of the class to that page, and I'll also put a quiz question there that I used for the class. So if, for example, you end up deployed or something and you miss class or whatever, you can basically click on the link, find out the video. These are horrible, though. Notice I've got no pro sitting there trying to do anything special with this. It's just running, so it's mostly the audio. But it's there at least, so hopefully you can not miss class, even if you miss class, etc. And the blog is where I post that. So, okay. And YouTube is where I post all the YouTube videos, so I'll usually just have like a link to the one for that day. There's tons of them there, and one of my goals is to give the FBI and the CIA so much information about me that they're bored to death. They won't be. It would take somebody full time just to keep up with all of the stuff I make available for them. Okay.
Don't forget the NSA.
I worked there for 4.5 years. So that was my second duty station. Okay, so this is the syllabus for tonight. I don't give them out on paper. Notice. So you don't have to go through Blackboard to get to it. You could just go onto my webpage to get to it, obviously. I hate Blackboard, actually. I do use Blackboard to email the whole class because it has that tool, so I can do that. But I don't think I'll be using it for anything else. So Blackboard, it's annoying mostly. Okay, so we have a theme. The course introduces works of da-da-da-da-da-da-da. You could read that if you're interested. A special note, by the way, I've got links from my webpage, but just because they're links from my webpage doesn't mean that I'm the one responsible for them, because I link to other things on the internet that I think you might be interested in, etc. So, grading. Everybody wants an A. I have exams, and they are posted. Notice they're 50% of the grade, and they are already posted. I have test 1, test 2, test 3, with the due dates listed on the syllabus itself. Notice that I give 6 questions, and your job is to pick 3 of those and email me 300 words at least for each of the questions you picked. So essays. No format requirements. Although if you're using a Mac, please don't send it to me on Pages, because I have no machine that will open those. I'll have to email you back and say, can you send it back in a civilized form? You know, 'cause I don't have a Mac.
Please use the export button.
Well, philosophy?
Yes.
So you get the idea. These are questions, they're hopefully thought-provoking questions. How do we know anything? You know, I don't know the answer to that. You know, but hopefully you'll spend some time thinking about it. Because remember, I'm thinking in terms of language learning is what's most important. And how do we learn language? By immersing ourselves in the vocabulary. So reading, writing, listening, speaking, doing linguistic things with the vocabulary. That's how you do it. So I'm interested in volume. So when you send me your essays, I will go and check the properties of the document. And if it says 900 plus words for a test, I give you an A, and then I read it. Yes, you see? So I go by volume. I believe that quality will come out of quantity. Same thing with push-ups. If you have to do lots of push-ups, I figure that's going to build muscles. And the more you do, the better for you, right? So if you want to get the most out of the course, read as much as you can. Obviously, we have lots in the text. And the internet is loaded with philosophy. It goes all the way back. So no limit to how much you could read to become more interested in the vocabulary. By the way, I do recommend that you not plagiarize. You certainly can get away with it, I'm sure. In fact, I have an interesting page that shows you how you can get automatic term papers without having to do anything yourself. Kind of fun. But the thing, of course, is what you're getting out of the course is what you exercise your mind to do. And if you're not exercising your mind, you're cheating yourself, not me. My wife already has the money for the course, right? So I'm good. I like that joke. So, and by the way, what is plagiarism? That's an interesting question, even by itself. I used to have a link. I think it's gone now. My link was to the old Microsoft encyclopedia that had a definition of plagiarism, but it went away. But basically, where I say that trying to pass someone else's work off as your own, I plagiarized that, just so you know. I didn't think that up myself. In fact, I'm not sure that I think anything up on my own. I think all of the thoughts that I have come from someone else. I'm just putting them together with my own arrangement. Plus, we might say that there's nothing new under the sun, which that quote goes all the way back to Ecclesiastes, if you're familiar with that. And by the way, I think she probably plagiarized somebody else when she wrote that. Anybody irritated with me saying that the author of Ecclesiastes was a she? No. Okay. No problem. There would be folks that would shoot me for saying that, but that's okay. You're not here. This was fun to write. So if you feel like laughing, hopefully you'll get some laughs out of this. Have you ever heard of Ringworks, the dialectizer? The neat thing about the dialectizer is you could go there and either enter a website address to dialectize, and the page will be transformed by the dialect, redneck in this case, or you can post text here and hit dialectize, and it will automatically change. And notice you have lots of other choices. It doesn't just have to be redneck. You could use jive, Cockney, Elmer Fudd. That's really fun, right? Swedish Chef, Bork Bork, is the meatball, all that.
Don't try to do it, you'll break your vocal cords.
Moron, Pig Latin, hacker, censor, all kinds. The reason you might find this interesting is if you copy from somebody else, but you don't want it to be recognized as plagiarized, you could run it through the dialectizer, and of course, it will look totally different, right? So that's fun. So for example, I took this paragraph, but you might ask if all my ideas come from someone else, and I'm just mixing them up into my own ideas. I ran that through Redneck, and I got, but yo my axe, if and all my ideas come from someone else, and I was just mixing them up into my, right, you get the idea. Experiment, it's hilarious. So that's fun. If you did that, would that be considered plagiarism? You ran it through a dialectizer and changed it? The teacher wouldn't be able to discover where that came from. Although, if they don't appreciate your grammar when it's redneck, you might not get a good grade for it, so that might not work. But still, it's kind of fun. This page is interesting. This is the one I mentioned earlier, right, that I would refer to. So you could go to this page, and every time you click on that URL, that address, notice we get a term paper. In this case, it's Capitalism and Post-Cultural Theory. You could change the author, I'm sure it's made up. Department of Ontology, whatever. Smith and Neocultural Semantic Theory. In the works of Smith, the predominant concept is the concept of pretextual consciousness. Baudrillard uses the term post-cultural theory to denote the failure and subsequent genre of capitalist sexual identity, etc. So you got a whole term paper, by the way. And by the way, it's got parts, and it also has footnotes, and it has references. So terrific, clearly an A term paper.
But wouldn't the amount of effort that you spend trying to fake this greatly exceed the amount of effort it would simply take to simply come up with 300 words of your own genuine thought?
If you're a really good fast typist, it probably wouldn't, no. You don't have to type this, just copy paste, right? But here's the interesting thing. If you sent this in to a professor and they got this term paper, they could never discover that it was plagiarized from the internet. Because watch what happens if I hit refresh on this website. The
Well, I continue
paper
to
just
see
totally
plagiarism.
turned to something else. The paradigm of language, Sartre's existentialism and pre-modernist de-appropriation. Notice I'll click refresh again. Subdialectic capitalism in the works of Rushdie. He's the one that the Ayatollah wanted dead.
Rushdie as in
remember?
Salman Rushdie?
Yeah.
As in,
Yeah.
what was it? Satanic Verses.
Satanic Verses, yeah. So consensus of John. So you see what happens instantaneously. This page becomes a totally different, non-repeatable term paper each time you click on it. One time in class, we actually had a couple people together click on it at the same time, and they ended up with the same paper. That was interesting. But otherwise, I've never seen a repeat of the information. So,
But wouldn't these papers be somewhere else on the internet?
nope,
Really?
they only exist the one time,
Huh.
and then they're gone. So if you copied that, as far as I know,
Yeah. Interesting.
which should be totally unfindable out there. So what's happening is there's a Dada engine. That's what they call the algorithm. And you add, and by the way, you could actually download, if you have a Unix server, you could download the Dada engine, And you could build your own site with the Dada engine and a database. Obviously, you need the database that it uses in order to create term paper. What's interesting is this basically was invented by a scientist named Sokol, and the what was it called? I don't want Alan Sokol, right? I'm probably spelling his name wrong.
I think there's an H in there is the problem.
I don't recall an H, but I'll have to look it up. But I even have the book. I can't think of the title offhand. But what happened was, he was a scientist, is a scientist. He's not dead. That obituary's not him. I hope. But he was disgusted with postmodernist journals. And he thought, this is just garbage. There's a lot of people that think that way, by the way. Noam Chomsky. Anybody familiar with Noam Chomsky?
I've heard the name, but I couldn't say.
Yeah, I think knowing about Noam Chomsky gets you shot in Alaska. But nonetheless, if you are
MIT
familiar-
linguist?
Yes.
Language?
Yes, yes, MIT.
Fireside.
80 something, no. So far left liberal, let's not even try to go there. But fascinating. I think we should read him and be absolutely horrified. You know, that's important. What Sokol was convinced was these postmodernists are absolute garbage. And by the way, the students that read all their crap basically are just destroying their minds. They're spending years in university and come out speaking this stuff, and they're absolutely useless to the real world, etc. Right? So bad, you know, to do this. And Noam, by the way, thinks that way as well. And so what Sokol did was he created a computer algorithm and a database of so-called postmodernist jargon, and he created a paper with it. He didn't write the paper, he created it with the computer, right? And then he submitted it to a postmodernist journal. They accepted it for publication and were absolutely thrilled about it because, this demonstrates to the world that we're serious, because a scientist has even written an article for our journal, right? But at the same time that it came out in publication in their journal, an article that he published in a science journal explaining what he had done came out simultaneously. And so, of course, all the scientists community reading this and saying, aha, he's proven that this is just garbage. The postmodernists are looking at it and saying, but it was a good article. What? Well, here's the fun part, though. A couple of MIT grad students ended up using the algorithm, and they compiled a science database, ran it through, came out with a science paper, which they submitted to a science journal competition, and it was accepted. So you begin thinking, what does this actually show us? And by the way, there's lots of software out there for you to have. A lot of writing now is machine generated. So we're on the cusp of one of the main things that people do when they get out of college is go and get a job where they write. So theoretically, the main thing that you learn in college is how to write boring research papers. That's not that any of those papers are going to be important. It's you're given a research project, okay, find out how many of the oil fields are producing more oil than they were last year, and get it to us by next week. Then you have to be the one that knows how to go out there and do that research, write it up in a way that's interesting, and produce the paper. So your college has been worthwhile to you because now you can do that. You've got lots of practice. Heinz.
So if we have a machine that generates something that, regardless of the quality or the merits of its origin, is now transferred into the human consciousness, is that now artificial intelligence?
It is AI, yes. Yes. We would call that artificial intelligence. I don't know that it would pass the
Turing.
Chinese room test.
The Turing test.
Or the Turing test. It
Well, you
would
see what
fool
I'm
us. I don't think, you couldn't have a conversation with it and convince yourself that you're actually speaking with a person.
Well, when I said artificial intelligence, I was kind of making a little joke or playing on words, and I wasn't necessarily referring to artificial intelligence as in the sense of a sentient machine, but in the regards to intelligence as a form of knowledge that was generated artificially.
Well, I have a GPS in my car. She's always telling me very politely where to go.
So is that a form of artificial
And
intelligence?
that's artificial intelligence, isn't it?
By that definition, yeah. I mean, by the
You look like you've.
I mean, I would say it's not necessarily like, artificial intelligence would be it generating its own thoughts, I would say, based on, it's more of a relaying information with a polite, nice lady voice to let you know that you need to take a right rather than actual artificial intelligence, my opinion, but that may be incorrect.
Well, I think there's two terms, as far as I know, what you guys are talking about is artificial intelligence. It's artificial general intelligence, to where, you could have a conversation with it, it can do its own things. But, that doesn't mean an artificial chess player is an artificial intelligence.
Right.
So there is AI, it's just not artificial general intelligence.
I do like my artificial chess player because I can pick the level. So I can just, I want to beat him tonight, so I'll pick this level instead of this one.
Sorry, I didn't mean to stir the pot.
Oh, please do. That's an important part of the dialogue. And by the way, please bring your devices and lunch if you wish. Although, good idea not to bring a lunch if it's going to bother the person sitting next to you. Be careful. That's, have common sense about what you're doing. No smoking in class, of course, even though some of the ideas might require a cigarette afterwards. Into that. No alcohol either, sorry, if you're into that. I know beer is supposed to help philosophy, but not in class. That's one of those things. You have your phones on. If you get phone calls, that's okay. If it has a particularly nice melody, though, I might dance.
I have a question about the exams. You said all the questions are all up and their due dates, so we can just do them, work ahead of time?
You certainly can. And in fact, you could even send them late. But I didn't hear that. But I hate actually doing math, so I'd much rather wait until you send me enough words and I can go, hey, for you. But make sure they're in before the actual end date of the semester when I've got to turn into grades, because I am honest. And if you haven't sent me enough, I won't give you the full grade. So.
And,
Did you have a question? No.
I have another question. But all the material on the exams, we're gonna go over it in class at some point? Or
Yes.
is we're supposed to put those links?
Yes, although you'll notice a lot of the material's already there, that you probably have your own thoughts about already. You could probably answer most of my questions. And you're welcome to do that, actually, although I'm hoping that the course will change some of your points of view. Is that possible? Is that a good thing? That's what college is supposed to be for. I think as Americans, a lot of us think of ourselves as kind of complete individuals, and it's an odd thing to think that the person that finishes the course is not the same as the person that started the course. But in a way, that's what it's supposed to do. We are supposed to be transformed by our experience. And by the way, I know I'm weird.
Me too.
She
I've had
also
enough-
knows that you're.
I have enough.
Yeah, I know, I know.
I've had enough people explain to me that, you know, I'm a weird person. But I think it was a requirement of the job, actually, so that's okay. But, you know, I read books, you know, that's, you know, more than one a week, usually. So that's kind of weird too, I suppose.
I think you should use one of those artificially generated thesis papers to apply for your PhD. You see what
No,
happens.
you know, actually, I'm fine with, I don't really need to pile it higher.
Come on, though, that was funny and you know it.
Yes, yes. You know, I was talking with one of the other professors in computer science, and he put a whole bunch of garbage in his PhD just to test, to see if any of his faculty were actually going to read it, and no one did. So that's kind of fun. Did anybody find Sokol? The Sokol controversy? That's so annoying. I hate it when I don't find. The Sokol affair, also known as the Sokol hoax. So that's fun. Is this doing good? Okay. So back to here. So basically, plagiarism is copying, not doing your own work. But I think that a perfect example, J.K. Rowling, Lady Rowling, right, the author of the Harry Potter series. She was sued for plagiarism. It seemed pretty darn obvious that she had in fact plagiarized some things. The court found her not guilty, which seemed odd, because there were a lot of, like, muggles. That was a word that had been invented by another author in England about 10 years prior to her use of it, and so on. And muggles is not a common word that you hear. That was pretty clearly started by the other author, and so on. In fact, have you ever seen, yes?
I was gonna say, one of the things I know about J.K. Rowling though is that she has, she's quite the expert with language. It's quite possible that she didn't, but she might have been using something else. Whatever, might have been using a similar root, happened to use the same, generate the same word for a similar reason.
So parallel development is what you're supposing.
Yeah.
Well, the problem I think the problem that the court faces is that the laws only cover copyrighted material, particularly copyrighted material. So you have to have it published, and if it's at least 20% different, then it's okay. So as long as she was 20% different than the original author, then she can use the term however you want. Like, you can't get sued for using Pepsi in your story. You can't get sued for using M&Ms or anything like that, just
That's
because
good
M&Ms have a
advertisement
trademark.
for them, yeah.
Or would the,
That'd be silly for them to want to sue you for it. You know, if you had it on your TV show, you know, free advertisement. You know, well, that's great. But yes, she had a double first. She had French and the classics when she graduated, and there's all sorts of elements, Greek elements in the way the story develops. Pretty interesting. But she obviously was taking bits and pieces of all sorts of stories and putting them together in a new way. So in a sense, it's plagiarizing.
Well, I would say that most epic stories suffer from the same basic issue that most of them can draw some sort of reference from, was it Gilgamesh?
Right. Yeah, yeah.
So
Lord of the Rings. You know, what-
Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Star Trek.
Then again, there's also a Russian thinker, author, philosopher, I think he was Russian anyways, who basically said that there's only 9 stories and everything's a variation.
Aristotle said there were just 2.
Do you know what I'm referencing? I don't know the guy's name.
Berdyaev, maybe?
Maybe,
I don't
that
know.
sounds about right.
But,
But do you have some idea of what I'm referring to? There's only 9 basic stories, like man versus nature, man versus self, man versus whatever. Those.
Joseph Campbell gives us one. You know, if you think about, right, Joseph Campbell, one, the heroes,
This is the archetype wolf
yeah.
story.
Oh, wait.
Saving your father from the underworld. Is that?
Yeah, this is the same
Yeah.
guy who wrote.
You should roll down these things.
You could get, of course, much more detail in this. You could go to the Campbell, there's a site that focuses on his work. He's dead now, Joseph Campbell. But George Lucas was a student of Joseph Campbell and said of him that he was my Yoda. So that's kind of intriguing, right? And the first Star Wars movie was based exactly on this plot. So Luke is the perfect example of the Joseph Campbell perfect hero. His book, Joseph Campbell's book, is A Hero of a Thousand Faces. It's
That's
really
it, yes.
boring, kind of like a phone book of stories, so you don't want to just read through it. But what he does is he looks at all the, maybe he didn't look at all of them, but lots of the great stories from all sorts of cultures, ends up realizing that the more elements of this type that the story has, the more famous and popular the story. So he narrowed it down and says, if you want the story to be absolutely popular, these are the elements that are essential to the story. And if you have these, then you're going to have a hit. And Lucas, of course, famously made the movie on a cheap budget and thought it would be just fun and didn't realize he was going to be totally remaking the way movies are made ever since. And now the movies all have to kind of imitate that same kind of
Standard all.
yeah, at least if it's going to be a big money maker. Of course, if you hate this, then you sell your crappy movie to Sundance, to try to get a few liberals to come and watch it and say how wonderful it was. However, so plagiarism, just fun topic for me. So hopefully by this point you're getting a good laugh out of this. Because what I did was I took a section that I got from the generator, the postmodern generator, and then ran it through Redneck, and as you can see, it came up with something really horrible. I'm sorry, I totally lost that on you. I'll go back. So test 1, test 2, test 3, yes, they're all posted, already there. Must Christianity change or die? Wow, fun topic. What do you think? Is modern democracy in trouble? So thought-provoking, hopefully, questions. But also we have a term project, which is 3,000 words. See what I mean? I'm looking for volume, right? And hopefully you'll use the vocabulary of philosophy. and practice it, become more fluent. Main thing with the term paper, it's obviously 3,000 words. Use at least 3 references. Well, you know, when I was in college, every page had to have at least 6 references, but I think you'd shoot me today if I asked that kind of requirement. But do use this list. Can you see I'm clicking on the link here? So I have a list of living, well, most of them are living, philosophers that I would like you to pick. And yes, you can send it early and often. And I'll keep saying, yes, A work, yes, but if you want, you can keep sending more. But Charles Murray, Roger Scruton, Thomas Metzinger, some of these I have links that you can look them up and stuff. I'm mostly interested, though, in your enjoying what you're doing, getting really interested in it so that you're having a good time doing all of that. Picking someone that you're interested in will help that, right? So look through them to find some. If I don't have a philosopher that you like and you have a favorite, wow, that's great. You can submit that person as your topic if you like. Please send it to me and I'll let you know if I agree or not. I usually say no if it's Ayn Rand or Anne Rand. I've still ended up with papers on her, which is okay. But there's a reason she's not officially considered an academic philosopher. She wasn't, actually. But so lots of different possibilities. Some of the ones I have listed are dead, so they're not living ones, obviously. So like Umberto Eco just recently died. Racks. He was fantastic. Peter Berger just died a few months ago. Real favorite of mine. I think he's written like 200 books. I think I've read about 100. Michael Foucault, Edward Said is interesting. Vine Deloria is really interesting. There's a lot of really interesting, recently dead folks. There's some that are not quite dead yet, but almost. They're all, they're stepping, like just over the grave. They're ready to take the plunge. I don't know. Joseph Ratzinger, if you're familiar with Pope Benedict the 16th, he retired and passed it on to Pope Francis. So Pope Benedict is now Eggs Benedict. It's a breakfast joke.
It's interesting, though, that you're referencing Eggs Benedict and Pope Benedict. And I think, is there a connection there to Benedict Arnold between Eggs Benedict and Benedict
No.
Arnold? No connection?
No.
Darn.
Benedict's just an old English name.
Darn. Because I could have made a joke.
Okay. So that's the term paper. And by the way, it can be about the philosopher's life. It could be about the philosopher's work. It could be a mix of both. Whatever floats your boat, basically. By the way, the one I really like, who I think is the sexiest philosopher alive, is Martha Nussbaum.
Critical examination is surely dangerous. We need to think hard about fear and where fear is leading us, but you might not be convinced so far.
So that's just fun. Martha Nussbaum means nut tree. Nussbaum. It's interesting. She just had an article in the New York Times too last week, I think. She doesn't like Trump. So that's kind of interesting. Well, let me just get rid of that. Okay. So, and then there will be a quiz question each class. And in fact, since we are really having 2 classes a night, right? 2 sections a night, where I have the syllabus set up. It's like the same as my other class that meets twice a week. We meet twice as long, so I'm using the same materials, so it's split into 2. Right? We'll take a break at roughly midpoint. By the way, if you need to get up and go for a potty break or whatever, please feel free. I'm fine with that, that sort of thing. And I won't wear the tie all the time. I just did that to fool you for the first night. No, I'll wear it. I have ties. More ties. When my dad died, I inherited all of his ties. A ton of ties. But the quiz question. So, what quiz question should I ask for the first part of the class tonight? I have a favorite, and you might think that this is an odd question, but it's kind of a memory test. What are the 10 Commandments? What are the 10 Commandments? Some people have responded by saying, oh, these were stone tablets that were handed to Moses on the hill. Well, no, what I mean is, what are the 10? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, Can you remember what the 10 Commandments are?
I've never known them.
And email them. Well, yeah, if that's the case, you could always say, I've never known them, never studied them, I have my own. And in that case, you could always make up your own. You get a lot of interesting ones. So, for example,
Rick Solomon. They're really fun.
you've seen some of mine?
Yeah, I was looking at the ones on your webpage.
Yeah. So these are some of my favorite commandments. The problem here is that these idol gods, these are gods that don't do anything. They're just sitting around. I think do not steal, that's the metal, Do not steal.
I will take a moment to point out, though, that the commandment that most people mistranslate and misunderstand as "thou shalt not kill" actually is properly translated as "thou shalt not murder." They're actually distinct, different words in the original, and there's plenty of killing in the Old Testament. So it's not "thou shalt not kill"; it's "thou shalt not murder."
I think it's actually thou shalt not do, not murder, something like that.
Well, that's English, though, and all translation is a lie. So that's just fun. That's a quote from Willard Van Orman Quine, his thesis of indeterminacy of translation. I've had enough fun with that myself. I remember at one point I was translating for the Russian coaches that were here for the Arctic Winter Games. And the one guy was from Magadan, and his accent was so thick I could not make heads nor tails out of what he was saying. And the one night they called me at home and said, we need a translator over at Gruning. So I ran over thinking, normally it was just the 2 coaches trying to figure out the rules or something. But at this time, they had, the guy was putting on a show with his team for an audience of about 200 people, and they needed someone to tell the people in the audience what he was saying. Yuri was speaking, and I couldn't make heads nor tails out of what he was saying, but I just bluffed and everybody laughed. Everybody had a good time. No one knew that I had no idea what he was really saying. Everyone laughed on cue when it was obvious that he was telling a joke, so I told a joke. They all laughed. He was very happy. They were very happy. I was the only one knew that just making this all up, that's part of the job, So that's neat. But so I'm not actually expecting you to give me the Hebrew, or if you're curious about those, I have them here. So there's the actual tablets. They're still out there looking for them. I found them. They're right there. Remember, they read this way.
I wasn't sure for a moment. Like,
So that's fun.
Moses destroyed the tablets.
And they don't use vowels.
they were remade if I recall.
But if you think about it, most of you probably studied them when you were younger, as a kid maybe. I've had elderly women sitting in my class when I asked this question, and they sat there crying because they couldn't remember them. And the one woman was, and I taught Sunday school, I can't remember them. It was so annoying. Well, but as we go over them, so, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no gods before me, do not take my name in vain, remember the Lord's day, no idols, no graven images, but I usually don't count that one because I was raised Roman Catholic and we love graven images. We got them all over the place. Honor mom and dad. Thou shalt not kill or murder. Right? Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not lie or bear false witness against thy neighbor, right? Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods or wife, right? So you think about that. You probably, I remember. On your own, you might not have remembered all 10. You might remember 6. In fact, the average is between 4 and 6. I usually get. Oddly, if I ask this in a class on main campus, the average is around 4. When I ask this in Eagle River, the average is around 6. So you guys know a little bit more, remember more of the commandments than the downtown folks for some reason. Puzzle your head over that one. But we don't remember them all. But as soon as I say them, you go, oh, yeah, how did I forget that one? Which tells me that you still had that in your mind. Right? You just couldn't recall it on a moment's notice. Right?
Well, in some way or another, even basic legal law is based around at least some set of rules like that. So it's in most religions, whether
Yeah.
they be based in Hebrew or whether they have something like that usually. So
George Carlin has an awesome comedy sketch on the Ten Commandments.
Oh, yes, so he breaks it down to just 2, doesn't he?
2 or 3, yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty awesome.
yeah.
That's not politically correct, though.
No, but it sure is funny.
Oh, wait, that's not me. What happened?
You went to YouTube? I'm not sure.
I know what happened. That should be enough, actually. So, I think this is the earliest list of commandments.
Oh, Hammurabi's 12
Code
laws.
of Hammurabi. This is actually a copy of the original, not the original. And I can't read Sumerian
Yeah.
or whatever it is, but there it is. 450, I understand there are 450 commandments on the stela, including very detailed dictates concerning if the house falls and kills the occupants, then the builder owes, his life and things of that sort.
We're in the Louvre in Paris, looking out.
So that's fun. That was made with this camera, by the way, in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Art and Archaeology, which my mom used to take me to when I was an infant, I guess. Kind of fun. I think I was born at the University of Pennsylvania, but in any case it was Penn Presbyterian, so I feel a connection to the University of Pennsylvania. But I actually only attended a few classes there, not as a student, but as a visitor. So the interesting memory task here, to remember the Ten Commandments, you try to remember what you could, and then if you want, you could certainly look them up to finish them up. But my curiosity is, the question is, how do you remember what you do in a way that you can recall it at a moment's notice? So we can't. So another example. How many of you remember how Mufasa died in the movie The Lion King?
Roughly.
Can you describe how Mufasa died for us?
He was falling off the cliff, and Scar grabbed his paw and flung him off.
Everybody picture it? You all picture it? Yes?
Yeah.
Everyone. How did you do that? Have you seen the movie lately? Yes? Yesterday, you watched it with your granddaughter. No, you don't have a granddaughter. Not yet, but that's okay. But you know what I mean, right? You've seen it, and it's in the visual cortex that stays there. And you can recall it.
Emotional attachment to the moment, and then your kid is probably pretty smart.
That's what I'm thinking.
Well, but I mean, you could even go and tell me the whole movie, probably. If I reminded you of, Scar, is reviewing his troops as they're all marching in this very dark place, right? And all the hyenas are marching by. And what does he say? You remember the song?
I roughly remember the tune, but I was more instrumental with that anyways.
Melodies help too, right? So, long story short, if I switch to a different kind of thing like the Ten Commandments, even though you studied them when you were a kid and probably had them memorized, just off the cuff of the moment or whatever that expression is. I think I screwed the expression up. You can't remember all 10, whereas you can remember the sequence that leads Scar to knocking his brother down into the canyon, into the onrushing animals, right? And Simba recoiling in horror because he thought it was his fault that his father had died, right? And Scar convincing him to, starting to do the whole movie, right? Right? But you can't do that with the Ten Commandments because what's the difference?
Visual aid.
The one is visual, the other one is just an abstract series of a formula of some sort, right? The one is a story. Traditionally, we remember things by passing stories on to the next generation. We tell things through stories. We're homo neurons, says Friedrich Jamison. Not me. I'm not Fred. He's a postmodernist. Homo neurons. We're man the storyteller. We tell stories. And The Lion King is a story, but the Ten Commandments is not a story, it's technical information. And when you study a course that has technical information, it's very difficult to remember it. You read a story, like, pick, what's your favorite story? Back in the corner. Your favorite story. Just whatever comes to
The Odyssey?
the Odyssey. So, 28 stories, 28 different situations that Odysseus is in.
Yeah.
One of them he's chasing the pigs off the cliff,
The one that sticks out the most is Calypso.
Calypso.
Yeah.
So, you can remember those because of the sequence, right? So that's pretty neat. Whereas if you're trying to remember formulas from your Calculus 1 class, how do you remember those?
Well, I know I'll remember the quadratic formula. Song.
There's a song. A song helps, yes? Yes. There's actually a song for the Ten Commandments, too. So it helps you remember them. You know. But my thinking is that we remember stories once you hear the beginning of the story, even a part of it. So if I'm standing here in a pair of ruby slippers and I click my heels together, what am I thinking? There's no place like home. Right? You didn't even hear the drive spinning, to come up with that. It was in random access memory, right? Wow, that's kind of amazing. So that's the fun thing about that quiz question, is it brings up the question of memory, how do we do that? And basically to argue that good philosophies are stories. And they're the stories that put us into the heroes circle and gives our life meaning. Because meaning comes from the story you believe about why we are here. That seems pretty much everybody agrees with today. Where does meaning come from? It comes from our being using a story. And by the way, stories are neither true nor false. They're interpretations of the data. Right? And the data can be true or false. But the interpretations, that's the same thing with, this is a cup. Everyone agrees? You might get into this as a mug or all sorts of other kinds of, but it's a cup. Everyone would agree it's a cup. So that's a true statement. It's a good cup. Is that true or false?
That's it.
It's neither, actually. It's neither true nor false because it's an interpretive. It's actually a terrible cup. It doesn't hold anything in it. I hope that doesn't stain the rug. It's tea. Oh well. So that's fun. So how about we take a break? About 15 minutes or so. Anybody have any questions for me or anything while we're...
The quizzes get turned into via email, you said?
Email. I know it's not really a great way to actually make sure everybody's here, because I'll post the quiz question on the blog, so of course even if the person isn't here, they can email me the quiz question.
So there will be one quiz for each class?
Right, I'll have a second one before we go home. We having fun yet? You guys aren't laughing as much as I'd like to have more laughter.
I'm having a great time. Fantastic. Yeah. Absolutely.
As an absolutely fascinating study on humor itself, why we have it. We're trying to study the evolution of humor. That's Daniel Dennett. Inside jokes. It's using humor to reverse engineer the mind, try to figure out why do we have it? Why do we enjoy it? Why you know, is there a pleasure associated with the joke? You know?
Neurochemistry.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember learning in like an acting class, and I've never been able to find something that said the same thing, but it said that they broke it down and that there's I think 7 different reasons why we laugh, 7 different categories that provokes the laugh response. One was that I can remember is surprise. Surprise is always a reason why people laugh. It was unexpected, so it provokes the laugh.
In logic, we cover fallacies, and to make it interesting, I compare a lot of fallacies are jokes, actually.
I've got a great joke about logic for you, may I?
Sure. You can erase the rest of that.
So,
Was that funny? That could have been hilarious.
Yeah, that was funny.
Maybe my presentation.
But I also thought it was interesting.
That's a whole nother question, you know, about what we've done with education and
Right, because you're right. There is no. If everyone can have an A, you know, what is excellence?
you obviously don't have to put in as much work as, well, we used to. Whereas it used to be we had to read all the time, you know. And even then you would still not guaranteed an A because put in all that work and it's still difficult.
Right.
Whereas today, if I don't give out A's, people will turn around and say that they didn't like my class. And then they don't recommend my class to other people, and then not very many students will take my class, and I end up not being able to give the class. So I'm out of work.
Calculus there.
Right. So if I want to keep teaching, I need people to like my class, and if I want people to like my class, I got to give easy A's. But it makes me feel guilty. So in logic, that equals therefore logic. What logic? Shouldn't it be? They are 3. Well, it's
I'm quite proud of that. I think it's hilarious.
1 equals 1, right? But that's false, because this one is on the left and this one's on the right. So they're not the same. That is called equivocation, where you're using a particular symbol or meme or whatever you want to call it in more than one meaning.
What you're saying is these jokes are fallacies?
It is.
It's still funny.
Well,
Something doesn't have to be
yeah,
true to
it's
be funny.
it seems that the reason a fallacy can also be fun. Sometimes it could be just maddening. You know, if the person didn't intend it to be funny, but if it's a fallacy and funny, it doesn't have to be equivocation. It could be other things. So, like Stephen Wright, for example.
Mr. Driving down the street past the gas station, there were 2 signs in the window, help wanted, self-service. So I went in and hired myself. So I get out of the bed, I figured I'd go for a walk. She said, how long are you gonna be gone? I said, the whole time. When I was out in the middle of the desert, a UFO landed. 3 1-inch tall guys get out. They walked over to me. He said, are you really 1 inch tall? I said, no, we're really very far away. I remember the day the candle shop burned down. Everybody just stood around and sang happy birthday. So I get off the plane and I forgot to undo my seatbelt and I'm pulling the plane through the terminal. And the wings are knocking people over. And then I almost broke both my arms trying to hold open a revolving door for a woman. I headed for the highway and began hitching. Within 3 minutes, I got picked up by one of those huge trailer trucks carrying 20 brand new cars. Climbed up the side of the cab and he opened the door and the guy said, I didn't have much room in here. I want to get in one of the cars and back. So I did. He's really into picking up people because he picked up 19 more. We all had our own cars. Then he went 90 miles an hour. We all got speeding tickets. I was cesarean born. Can't really tell. Although, whenever I leave the house, I go out through the window. I had a dream. I had a dream that all the babies prevented by the pill showed up. They were mad. I remember when I was 7, my grandmother said, Stephen, come over here. I said, what do you mean? She said, you know, you're over there, now come over here. I said, all right. And she said, here's $10 and don't tell your mother that I'm giving this to you. And I said, it'll cost you more than that.
So he's not using equivocation, he's using whole phrases to mean something different, essentially. And so that's called, instead of equivocation, it's called amphiboly, where you change the meaning of the whole phrase. Ambiguous. It's ambiguous. So one morning I shot an elephant in my pajamas. How he got into my pajamas, I'll never know, right? You get the idea. But so, humor, kind of fun. Okay. So, and the syllabus I have all of this, obviously. I do have an office downtown, but I usually don't go there. And I don't have an office here anymore because I'm officially retired, I guess, from full-time. So they don't give people that are part-time offices, although there is an area downstairs where we can hang out and use computers and things of that sort, although those are just for teachers, so I don't know how we would actually get to meet. But if you do want to have a chat or something, Email is good. You can also call me, but we could also arrange a time to meet someplace too if you want to chat about stuff. That's cool. What else? My office in main campus is in the Administration and Humanities Building, room 277. So that's if you're ever down there. But I'm usually not. The main reason I'm not is because I don't like to pay for parking.
They make the
Outrageous.
faculty pay for parking?
Well, of course, everybody pays for parking.
Wow.
However, there's free parking here, so that's good. But so if I'm down there, like I was there today for a little bit of time, Fridays are free, and weekends are free, and so on. So, whatever. Okay. So notice the way my syllabus is set up. I indicate what we're going to discuss during the evening. So August 31st, today, I do have a lecture. What is philosophy? Love of wisdom. We also want to learn the tradition. We want to take up the quest. As you get into philosophy, you're not just learning the tradition, but the tradition progresses. And frequently what I've noticed is that individuals growing up commonsensical in our country have reached a certain philosophical point of view that comes from their peers, their parents, their schooling so far. But generally speaking, they'll reach a point in the tradition where they'll begin to be surprised by what the philosophers are saying, and that will shock them into thinking that what they knew was not the sort of thing that is considered still the case. In other words, their point of view will change, right? And it doesn't last, because then the next philosopher, I discovered this, when I remember I was raised Roman Catholic, so I got into philosophy, and I thought, the priests knew all the answers, and I basically understood what they taught me in high school and everything. So I thought I knew, and then I got into philosophy, and they started going through the history of philosophy. I had ancient, medieval, modern, 19th century, contemporary, existentialism, right? All these are separate courses and so on. And as I started going through that, I thought, oh, Plato had all the answers. Woof. Thank goodness. I was worried about all this stuff thanks to Mr. Williams and his questions, right? But then I got into ancient, and I thought, Plato, he had the answers. And then Aristotle, who's Plato's student, comes along and totally destroys Plato. So, of course, once you get really into Plato and you think, now I know all the answers, and then Aristotle comes along and you feel like, wow, what an idiot. Why did I believe him, right? But it doesn't stop there, because then it goes through the same kind of process later with the post-Aristotelians, with the Christian period, St. Augustine. It's just absolutely beautiful stuff. But then he ends up in problems, right? Because Aristotle comes back, and there's conflict there, right? And then, then comes Aquinas, and you've got, wow, there you go. We've got the answers finally. And by the way, Aquinas is still officially the dogma of the Roman Catholic Church, and that's from 1260 AD. So the church is a little on the slow side, depending on what you're looking at, right? Depending, right?
Well, if you're convinced that you're perfect and that you're right, then there's no need to change ever.
Well, or you can, in 1952, they finally reversed their thoughts on Galileo.
Yeah, that's when they formally announced that.
I believe so, yeah.
Or
So-
they reversed his excommunication at least, or something like that.
Well, he wasn't excommunicated.
No?
No, he was, he reversed his position. He rejected his.
Recanted.
He recanted. Martin Luther didn't. That's a whole other story, right? In any case, Aquinas. Great stuff, right? But then comes the modern period where you have the revolt against Aristotelian science. And by the way, Galileo is part of that. That was one of the problems, right? Galileo starts dropping things off of the Tower of Pisa tilts, like, right? You've seen it, these pictures of it, right? It's great, you know, the people post selfies where they're like doing stuff. You've seen it, where they do selfies.
When you're referencing Galileo dropping things off the Tower of Pisa, are you referencing the scientific experiments about the rate of fall, like
About
with
gravitation.
the bowling ball and the feather and all that?
Right, right. See,
Yeah,
so you can do selfies. Obviously, that's a good one. Yeah, so they were dropping various weights off of there. The author Heilbrunn says, boy, that area must have been a pretty dangerous one when they were doing philosophical arguments, because you didn't want to be under them dropping stuff down on you. But Aristotle argues that a heavier weight, drops faster than a lighter weight.
On the surface, it seems logical enough.
Well, that was considered true for over 1,000 years. It puzzles you, you know, it took over 1,000 years before somebody decided to test that. But it actually turns out to be harder to figure out than, Galileo even argued that a feather being dropped in a vacuum would drop as fast as a heavy weight, like a ball or something, right?
Hasn't that since been proven to be true?
Yes.
Yes.
They even
In
brought
fact, I think-
they even brought a hammer and a feather up in one of the Apollo missions just to do it. Yeah, it's that one right there.
Because
Is
isn't
it
it
this
just
one?
air resistance that
Oh,
makes it
I'm thinking of,
appear to fall slower?
yeah, this is, so this is inside a vacuum.
This is NASA's Space Power Facility near Cleveland, Ohio, and it is the world's biggest vacuum chamber. It's used to test spacecraft in the conditions of outer space, and it does that by pumping out the 30 tons of air in this chamber until there are about 2 grams left.
Notice his Ohioan
An
accent.
eccentric construction, which is part of its history. It was built in the 1960s as a nuclear test facility to test nuclear propulsion systems, and that meant that they built it out of aluminium to make the radiation easier to deal with. Aluminium is not the best thing, the strongest
say
material
aluminum.
to build a vacuum chamber out of. So they built an outer concrete skin, which is part radiation shielding and part an external pressure vessel, so that this thing can take the force that's present on the outside when it's pumped out to the conditions of outer space.
Is that a red bowling ball? And a feather.
Galileo's experiment was simple. He took a heavy object and a light one and dropped them at the same time to see which fell fastest. Now in this case, the feathers fell to the ground at a slower rate than the bowling ball because of air resistance. So in order to see the true nature of gravity, we have to remove the air.
Is this interesting? I don't want to bore anybody.
It takes 3 hours to pump out the 800,000 cubic feet of air from the chamber.
We dropped 2 millitorr in the last 30 minutes.
But once it's complete, there's a near perfect vacuum inside.
6104 tank with 10% open. Station 1, go for drop. PCB 30-1, pressure set point at 240 psi. ER, go for drop.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. Count it down. 2, 1. Release.
Slow-mo. Feels like you got cheated, doesn't it? That does make it interesting.
Look at that.
They came down exactly the same. Wow.
Exactly. Exactly the same. Feathers don't move, nothing. Look at that. That's just brilliant.
That's cool. So Galileo is part of that. So there's a revolt against the Aristotelian science, which couldn't have happened if Aquinas hadn't made it legitimate to study Aristotle in the first place. So each of these stages is kind of absolutely essential to the next one. Right? And then we end up with Descartes, Bacon, Hobbes, Spinoza, Locke, Hume, and then Kant. Right? So we end up going through each generation literally very close, right? And knew one another, right? Wrote to one another, and we end up with a Copernican revolution, Kant called it, in his own thinking, that really changed the way we think about how we understand the world. And that really opened up a lot of other problems. So psychology really developed, I think, after Kant, but we also have other problems that Kant said you can't know this, and others, Europeans, started saying yes you can, and so a different group follows Hegel in Europe and takes their own lead, which is why most of us today can't really understand the Europeans, because they're doing Hegelian philosophy and postmodern philosophy, and that's why Noam Chomsky thinks they're crazy, because he doesn't speak their language, and I don't mean French. Right? But then we have the analytic tradition in England and in the United States, and they follow a slightly different tradition, but what we're seeing is those two traditions now have merged. We end up with still more interesting things going on today, and so there's still progress. In each of these stages you end up, by the way, one of the things that, you know, we talk about gravity, right? Does everybody believe in gravity?
Well, here.
Because Einstein gives us a different theory that says the reason those two things fall together like that is because they're both moving on a trajectory that's the same, and the Earth is moving on a trajectory that's collapsing in on it at exactly the rate by which those two things come together. So there's no force of gravity that's attracting those to the Earth, but instead they're traveling in a way that brings them together, right? But that's really confusing. If you're driving down the Glen Highway in your car and you're trying to keep track of the movement of the Earth, which is traveling at how fast in a circle? Rotation?
It's like 1,000 miles per hour.
1,000?
It's like 1,100 almost.
1,100? Okay.
Well, at the
so,
equator.
and it's heading towards the east, right? Because the sun rises in the east, sets in the west, so we say, because we never caught up to the fact that no, the Earth spins towards the east. The sun doesn't rise or set; it's just staying there. We didn't change that vocabulary, right? But if you think, wait a minute, so like when I stand on my back deck and I'm looking for like the Perseids or something, I'm told I should look to the northeast, right? Because that's where we're moving in space into those meteorite showers, right? So we're moving that way. So that's where I should look. If I look over here, I'm not going to see the meteorites coming in. So I've got to look that way. So I think of myself as kind of driving my house in that direction. It's kind of a boat sailing on the earth, you know. Every once in a while it rocks a little, but we're going in that direction. But if I'm driving the car, and I'm driving the speed limit, 65 miles an hour, and I'm trying to stay on a road that's traveling 1,100 miles towards the east, right? Well, that's very confusing, because you're like worried, you know, what if I slide off the road, you know? It's really much easier for me to think of the Earth as stationary and me driving on it than to think of all of the complex aspects of the Earth moving. And by the way, the Earth is moving in that context, but the sun is actually traveling, right?
And taking us with it.
And taking us with it. So instead of the Earth going around the sun, we're all kind of traveling if you think of the sun as traveling like this, in that direction, and the Earth is kind of right. So the Earth is, oh, I screwed it up. But you get the idea. You know, the Earth is kind of going like along with the sun, which is not, by the way, going in a straight line because it's being pulled by all the weight of the other planets, etc. So what we've got is a whole bunch of things traveling around. There's a neat video here. Shoot, I missed it.
Is that sending the satellite close to the sun? Is that what you're doing?
Sorry about the music, it's terrible. It's kind of a corny video, but I wouldn't call it incorrect. It's just multiple models that are all true. Is all way too fast. It would have to be much slower and spread out, right? But it gives you the idea that if everything's kind of traveling around, does that make sense? So that's kind of interesting. I find a lot of people that think of the sun as stationary in space, and all the planets just going around it like this. But it's obviously traveling. It travels 250 million. What is it? Every 250 million years, it travels all around the galaxy, right? So that's about.
Just the first I've heard of that. That's pretty mind blowing.
They go
Which-
up and down inside the galactic plane as well every 26,000
Yeah.
years.
In the galaxy itself, probably.
The Odyssey, by the way, there's a computer scientist that analyzed the Odyssey and argued that the 28 stories show the 28 years that Jupiter goes in its orbit, and that the stories are based on the stars that are behind Jupiter as it's moving, so that each story is essentially a reminder of what comes next. So that, but the trouble, several of the problems is the story is so old, it's from India, that the stars are not there anymore. They've moved, because of course we've moved. So that the background stars certainly change. So that by the time the Greeks had the story and it became the Odyssey, it no longer was a good way of keeping track of where Jupiter would be this year. So that's kind of interesting. By the way, not everyone agrees with him on that. That's kind of interesting. So science keeps developing new theories that seem excellent with regard to predicting certain characteristics of our experience. And so we treat them as correct, but then we come up with a new model that changes that. And by the way, not all the models are useful for everything. So it seems like we can use lots of different models, and as long as we have the best model for whatever we're using it for, we say it's true. So we can keep in our heads multiple models and say it's perfectly true that the Earth goes around the sun. It's also perfectly true to say that the sun goes around the Earth in a mirror image of the other model. By the way, that model would be the Tycho Brahe model, and that's referred to, of course, as the conic model. Which looks like this. So the idea there is, Galileo did prove that Venus does not go around the Earth, it goes around the sun. That was the significant experiment that he did with the telescope, that he could see Venus in the different phases of Venus. And so he could prove that it was going around the sun and not around the Earth. So you have to adjust things to keep the Earth in the center. You see how he drew this? This is the way it should look when you look at it with the telescope if it's going around the sun. So that's the experiment that proved that Venus, at least, doesn't go around the Earth, or around the sun. But he also looked at the moon and saw things on the moon. I can see that from here. I don't know. You look at the moon at night, you could see stuff on the moon. But I suspect our atmosphere is much better than what Galileo had to deal with. I'm not sure.
Better telescopes, but also better understanding of the sea.
Well, our atmosphere is thinner here because we're further north, right? So I remember when we first came out to Alaska, we were like, oh, how did they get the sky like this? It was amazing. But he also saw solar spots, sunspots. By the way, advice to all of you, if you have telescopes, do not use the telescope to stare at the sun. Bad idea. No doubt in my mind whatsoever why Galileo was blind before he died. He'd be looking with the one eye until it hurt too much and he'd shift to the other one. It hurts me just to think about it. Do not stare at the sun. By the way, staring at the sun is even a metaphor for death. Just so you know. Irvin Yalom even wrote a book called Staring at the Sun. It's all about, he's a psychiatrist talking about death. So, as you're studying philosophy, the progress that happens is startling and changes your mind about things. And sometimes that's pretty drastic, and it could really screw you up. In fact, there are some people that commit suicide because they end up losing their minds over it. And that's pretty darn scary. We even had David Foster Wallace. Are you familiar with him at all? committed suicide when he was, what, 44? 44, right? Math skills are not very good. 36? Ah, oh, it even says it right. I was not really reading it, I was just trying to remember what it was. So he's absolutely amazing. When you listen to him read some of the stuff, he's fantastic. He knows. And what did he do? Hung himself in the garage. Oh crap, I've been having students read his stuff. That's scary. I don't want them imitating him. That's pretty bad. But he got to the point where he basically felt like he understood everything, and then he was bored. Depressed. His major novel is called Infinite Jest. Let's see, is it? Here it is. It's a huge, huge book that's amazing to some people and boring as sin to others. Kind of autobiographical. But reflects the educated attitude towards the meaning of life and what people try to do in order to enjoy life when they believe that kind of narrative about what life is all about as a narrative. And it's a conflict of narratives, and you're having to pick the best narrative. It doesn't work, apparently, if that's the case. So that's pretty intriguing. So learning the tradition means also that you're taking up the quest, that you want to follow this progress along the way. I mean, on the one hand, you want to learn, well, what do we really know today? And yet at the same time, this could be mentally traumatizing to us, because a lot of the things we believe, the stories we believe, when we're kids. I believed in Jesus, what the priest told me, right? And I got to a point where I thought, wait a minute, there's no possible way that this kind of stuff could have happened, right? In fact, here's my second quiz question for you for tonight. It should be fun. Jesus comes to your door. Politely, and you're not like, who's this bearded weird guy at my door? You know, hypothetically, that this is Jesus, and he comes to your door, you let him in, you know that he is Jesus, and you know that he is God. Hypothetically, you have no doubt about it. And Jesus says to you, sell everything you have, give the money to the poor, and then come and follow me. My question is, do you go with him? Or do you argue with him? Imagine yourself in that situation. How would you dialogue with Jesus in that? Yes, I'm on my way. Let me just put the baby in the stroller. Ooh, what if you have a baby? Can you just do that? You drop everything? You just
Sell the baby.
Sell the baby.
So the question is, what do you do in this circumstance?
Yeah, what would you do? Would you go with him? And in a way, by the way, I'm sure it's actually a live question. Theoretically, that's something that Jesus says in the gospel. And by the way, an awful lot of people believe it exactly that way and take up holy orders. When I was in school, in grammar school, I went to a school where the teachers were nuns of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Every one of them had given up this life, basically. Took the vow of poverty, and that they would do what the order told them to do, and so on. So they had just the habit that the order designed that they would all wear. I lived in a convent, I had no family, etc. When I was in high school, I had priests from the Augustinian order of St. Augustine. And the same, they were all wearing the same habit. They had no income. They lived in the monastery on a hill right behind the school. They had no property whatsoever, just what various people would like lend them for things. The one priest I knew had a car that he wasn't the owner of, but he could go places, mostly to drive to the churches he preached at on Sundays, but he could do other things with it. So he had a car, but it wasn't his, it was owned by someone that was lending it to him. So there are people, now by the way, of course, there's fewer people that do that and sacrifice that kind to that kind of life today. In fact, I know I was on the road to doing precisely that and basically decided, I can't do that. I went to college instead of seminary. Almost went to seminary. When I finished my master's, my wife and I thought about my going to seminary, and I applied, was accepted, the Episcopal Church, because you could go there with a spouse. In fact, a lot of the seminarians that we met had spouses. They were accepted, but at the last minute I decided to join the Army instead. I wanted to have a lot of money instead. So I joined the Army. Actually, it worked out pretty well.
So you were an officer?
No, I enlisted as a Russian linguist. They sent me to Monterey for a year to study Russian. And while I was in Berlin, I decided, gee, I might as well take my test in German. I passed that. I thought, gosh, that was easy. How about French? I took my test in French. So they paid me for all three. Great. What luck. Of course, that makes you pretty weird. Russian linguists in the military were thought as weird. Even by their own officers, they thought we were weird. That's interesting. But they pay us a lot. So then they retired me after 16 years, 9 months, and 3 days with the early out that they gave those of us that volunteered for it. So that was cool. So I got a full retirement even after only 16 years, 9 months, and 3 days. And the most dangerous thing I ever did in the Army was drive on the Glen Highway in an ice and snow. So I feel guilty. I go to McDonald's and they give me a 10% discount. Like I really didn't earn it, you know.
The token.
But I think really good. So that's cool. So what is the tradition? Well, it doesn't start with Socrates. The official first philosopher was Thales.
Thales?
Yes. Thales of Miletus, which is in Turkey, but it was a Greek colony, so he was Greek. I wonder if my links still work.
Why is he considered the first philosopher?
It's really a fraud, I think, but officially, he's one of the 7 wise men of Greece. I don't know who the other 6 were, but he wondered what made the cosmos. Where does the cosmos come from? And all the other stories that explain where the cosmos come from started off, well, like Genesis, where the hand of God stirs above the waters and draws up the dry land. So you've got a God, anthropological, man-like God that does something, creates something. oh, here you might have Raven do it, you know, or Hawaii, you know, that they pull it up, they're fishing and they pull up the islands. Well, that's not really creation of the universe. You get the idea that it's very anthropomorphic. An individual like us creates it. Thales was trying to figure it out in what we might think of as a more scientific way. Where does everything come from? And his answer was water. Decided that he thought water was the original element, what the Greeks called the arche. So we get the word arch, or archaeology, or architecture, you know, the arch.
Or archaic.
Yeah, yeah. Wherever you get ARCH in English, it's the Greek root for
Original or ancient?
building block, whatever. So now we don't have texts from him, we have quotations that were passed on by others, mostly Aristotle. But that was only for about one generation. The next individual comes along, Anaximenes, he's also from Miletus, and he argues that it's air. And his argument is that air is, now, you know, this is not, you know, air pressure or oxygen and nitrogen or what, you know, none of that, right? That doesn't come along until much, much later, you know, when they even realize, you know, I mean, it's modern period, really, when we get to more things like that. But the idea that air exists as an arche and water seems to be thicker than air, right? So the one should explain the other and not the other way, right? And then you have Anaximander, and he goes really way out there, and he argues that the arche is the infinite. I think they killed him because it gave him a headache. Thou shalt not come up with such an absolutely bonkers idea. It's just too hard. You know, because, you know, you end up, you know, so if I shoot an arrow at that wall, before it hits the wall, it has to go halfway. Before it goes halfway, it has to go half that distance, half that distance, half that distance, half that. I can never get there. There's an infinite number of points for it to traverse. It can't possibly cover an infinite distance in a finite amount of time. You know, great heads exploding. Imagine. Yes? You've not puzzled out the problem of the infinite?
I think we're more trouble phrasing with anything than anything else, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, Zeno's considered the one that does the best job of that. Zeno paradoxes. Achilles and the tortoise, for example. So, once they come up with the mathematical concept of infinite, the infinite, we can't go back. Our heads are blown, and we're you know, all sorts of problems. By the way, a great book on this is David Foster Wallace's Everything and More, which is, I think, the best book on the infinite. Just me. Yep.
Those are fractals.
Fractals?
Fractals.
Are these fractals?
They are fractals.
Both.
Like the concept is.
It's fractal in nature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have no idea
Well,
what you are saying.
Almost everything's a
Fractals are where the same algebraic pattern repeats at
Yeah.
constantly
Yeah, I'm
infinite
familiar with that,
levels.
but I'm not understanding how that corresponds to that.
Well, the problem of the infinite, I think, leads to the idea of fractals. The Mandelbrot set,
Right,
right.
that's what it looked like, that's what it made me think of.
Now that I've got a visual, I get it. It's like,
Oh, I see.
Aristotle's solution to this, by the way, was to say that the problem is you're using an infinite number of points, but you're only allowed a finite amount of time to get from point A to point B. If you're going an infinite number of points, what you need is an infinite amount of time. If you're going a finite amount of points, then a finite amount of time. So it depends on you're using a system that basically allows you to accomplish the mission. You know, if you're thinking in terms of an infinite distance, but only have a finite amount of time to get there, you'll never get there. Can't possibly get there, right? Will always be close, but not quite there, right? And so on. Of course, a lot of people disagree with Aristotle, so just because someone comes up with a nice solution to that doesn't mean that that's adequate for everyone.
What's Anaximander's time frame, like, when was he alive?
You know, I picked from my links texts, but if you go to Wikipedia, which turns out to be absolutely wonderful in quite every respect, you'd see his dates here.
So do you remember if they had very much Egyptian exposure at that
I'm
time?
sure they did.
Because Egypt pantheon, the Egyptian pantheon
2,000
deals
years
with it-
before,
with the,
yeah.
with the infinite, pretty, almost succinctly with the different philosophies there.
Yeah, well, the trouble with the Egyptians is we don't know what they had. We're learning, like the Pythagorean theorem, you know, that's been attributed to Pythagoras, but they've now found it in Egyptian stela or
Yeah.
other, which is way older than Pythagoras.
it was only this past century that we discovered the, what is it, I'm thinking of, the Rosetta Stone or something like that? So we haven't even been able
Well,
to
that was,
translate anything.
yeah, the Rosetta Stone. Which, by the way, the museum sells like
I've
models
actually,
of. You
I've
can-
actually seen the real thing in England, so
Yeah,
it's pretty
yeah.
interesting to see.
How did I get that? We're saying that this is the Greeks coming up with all this stuff, but it's pretty clear that a lot of the stuff the Greeks were coming up with, they got from Egypt, maybe India, who knows? You know, this.
Well, water and air is right in the beginning
Mesopotamian,
of the Bible.
yeah. You know, so the Babylonians had a water myth. Genesis is a water myth. The Egyptians had the Nile, so they have water myths, but they're different than Babylonia because Babylonian priesthood never really knew when the snows were going to melt. They even had runners up in the mountains whose job was to run down and tell me when it's melting so that I could predict the flood. And the trouble was they couldn't run fast enough, and so the priests kept getting wiped out because they were wrong. Whereas in the Nile, it was so predictable that the priesthood really was good and stable for, you know, except for Akhenaten, who wanted to wipe them out, and they instead wiped him out, which he's in the museum too, by the way. I got to see him. So what I'm doing is taking you through just a little bit here. These are the arches, the basic building blocks. Heraclitus, famously, he's from Ionia. He gives us the metaphor of fire as his arche, and what he really means is change, it seems. But it's very ambiguous, so we don't really know exactly what he's talking about, Heraclitus. By the way, all these names mean something. Phalo, I think, means water. Heraclitus is the glory of Hera, which is the goddess of time, where we get the word hour from. and she was Zeus's wife. So that's, I never looked up Zeus. What happened? Security
It
threat.
didn't like you.
What security threat? Heraclitus. Okay, so, oh, we can go like this.
Make sure Google approves of it. Oh, it has a bad word in it. That's why.
It has a bad word.
Yep.
Well, no. Sorry. So Heraclitus basically argues that you can't really have objects. Nothing really persists over time because everything is in flux. Everything is in changing constantly. So you can't step into the same river twice. It's one of his famous quotations. Aristotle argues with him and says, well, but actually you can't argue with Heraclitus because he's arguing with himself. So basically all you have to do, Aristotle says, is shoot him and move on. Well, no, not really shoot him. Aristotle didn't have a gun. Imagine if he had a gun. Ooh, that would have been interesting. So, Anaxagoras gives us atoms, or Democritus gives us atoms. Anaxagoras also refers to it as nous, or mind, N-O-U-S. Nu, Omicron, Upsilon, Sigma, if you do Greek, whatever. But mind.
Which is the Egyptian goddess of the infinite.
Yeah. Is that Isis?
No, new.
New. No kidding. That's new. For me. Sorry.
So
Pythagoras.
the philosophy class, right?
Pythagoras is cool. Pythagoras, pith means to speak out. Agoras is in the agora or in the marketplace. And which is odd because apparently he had a secret society, so he didn't speak out in the marketplace. He kept it a secret. So I don't know. But everyone, of course, thinks of his Pythagorean theorem, how you could figure out the hypotenuse of square, whatever it is.
Maybe he was making a joke and he meant it ironically, kind of like a big guy being called tiny.
Could be. Plato, by the way, was a nickname, and it meant broad. And a lot of people argue this because he was very broad-shouldered. He was a good wrestler. But by the way, Plato's official name is Aristocles, which means Aristoi are the best, and Cles is honor of, like Heracles, glory of Hera. Aristocles, the glory of the best. He's an elitist. His philosophy is idealism, where the good is the top and the elite is the best. So the rule of the best, the Aristoi, where we get aristocracies, right? The rule of the best. But Pythagoras also comes up with the shapes which become the Platonic solids. So the Plato solids. The neat thing about these is that these shapes are the only ones, as far as I understand it, that have equal sides. They all have equal sides. Roger Penrose tried to do something, and you get the Penrose shapes, but
I just read an article recently that scientists discovered a new shape that skin cells are made out of near joints, which is how your skin is able to flex in the way that it does, or something like that. That was actually pretty interesting. I don't remember the name of it, but hey, a new shape.
But notice these. Here's a good picture. So notice we've got the one they think gives us earth particles. The other one gives us water. The other one gives us air. The other one gives us fire. And then the fifth essence, the fifth element, which you notice is not a cute little redhead named Leilu. Multipass. Don't use that one on post. Multipass. No, don't do that. It's not right.
Now I have to.
I would love to, but no, you'll get arrested, so don't.
No, they won't
Don't
arrest me.
They might not get it. You know, they've got to be old enough to get that one. Most of the folks in here did not get that. Right? Are you familiar with Leilu? You? Yes?
Bruce Willis.
But you are not?
Fifth
Bruce
Element.
Willis?
Mia
Fifth Element?
Jovovich.
It's not my fault. It's just true.
Some people know.
Some people know, yeah. Odd movie. Odd movie. Good music, though. Odd singer, though.
Yeah.
And how do you sing like that with a brick in your stomach? That's kind of weird.
4 bricks.
4 bricks,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah. So this is cool. By the way, this is this persists because Aristotle picks up on this too and considers this to be correct. That this is the basic set of arcades that build everything. Today, of course, we